Build Right is the educational division of Sparkbox, working to inspire and empower a web built right. For more information about Build Right or to have one of our workshops at your company or event, check out buildright.io. If you'd like to have Sparkbox help you make your web better, visit csparkbox.com. You're watching Brad Frost's Build Right Maker Series on Atomic Design from March 26th of 2015. The Build Right Maker Series is brought to you by the folks at Sparkbox and these generous sponsors. DataYard, performance-driven cloud hosting for kick-ass websites and applications. Campaign Monitor, a simple and elegant email marketing software for business. Shopify, a hosted, theme-based e-commerce platform. Harvest, simple time tracking, professional invoicing, powerful reporting software. Additional thanks to our secondary and giveaway sponsors for their help in making the Build Right Maker Series possible.
So where we left off, I was sort of showing you the nuts and bolts of Pattern Lab, what it does. Pattern Lab also has with it a bunch of other features. Sort of with it, I see sort of Pattern Lab as simultaneously a development tool, but also as an educational tool. Again, to be able to expose that whole design system to your clients, to your bosses, to help them better understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And a big part of this is coming down to the fact that it's now our job to make responsive interfaces that bend and flex and look and function great on any size screen. So I made a little tool a while ago called Ish, and basically what Ish does is whenever you click on the small viewport size, it gives you a smallish viewport. You click on small again, it gives you another smallish viewport. You click on medium, medium-ish, large, large-ish, right? That's the idea. And again, the idea behind this is to get people away from thinking of like iPhone view, iPad view, desktop view, right? It's not really about that. It's about sort of making sure that we're covering all bases. And with one of the projects I was working on, the client didn't even know that you got a different value every time you clicked on it until like 2 weeks before the thing launched, which is awesome. Like that for me is like a win, like a huge win. Whereas she was like, oh yeah, like on small mode, it's you know, this particular thing is a little out of whack. I was like, well, you know, do you know exactly what size? Because you get a different value every time. She's like, what? It's awesome. Also a little pixel to M converter inside each of theirs, which is pretty cool. And then the client favorite disco mode, where you click a disco and it just bounces around like crazy. And the clients are like, look at it go, look at it go. And it's great, because again, you know, this goes a really long way to helping the client better understand what responsive design is, what you're actually trying to accomplish with this project, and really like exposes that. It's a bit cheeky or whatever, but and there is a pragmatic, I think, benefit to it, just because you're able to sort of see what it looks like in those in-between states, and you might actually come across some areas where it's like, this looks a little crappy here, or maybe the line lengths are too long, or maybe this image is too big, or whatever. So that's cool. Annotations are another cool thing. Basically, you know, I come from a process, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in a bit, where people would create these high-fidelity wireframes, right? These like 200-plus page PDFs that like go into an insane amount of detail and fidelity about sort of what's going on with this interface and how this thing is supposed to be designed. And you know, by the time that PDF gets to me, I'm like, that's nice, and I throw it in the trash can. And again, like there's a lot of good thinking that's going on there, but like as you sort of get into the browser, that stuff becomes less and less important, and it sort of fades away and dies off and gets thrown in the trash. So that's what we're trying to solve with annotations in Pattern Lab. So basically, you could actually sort of go through and assign any DOM element, any sort of pattern you want, and write some annotations around it. And it actually shows up, sort of like attaches itself to the actual thing, which is pretty freaking cool. And you could actually sort of click on the things and jump to the annotation. It also shows up in the sort of like list view too. So this is for the timing project. We're able to say fonts, we're serving up our fonts via Typekit and blah, blah, blah. Here's our animations and so on and so forth. So we're what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all that design thinking, that really good design thinking that would otherwise be thrown in the trash, and try to get that language into the final environment. Then there's this idea of lineage, and this is probably one of the biggest things. And what I was saying earlier, with respect to a lot of pattern libraries that exist out in the wild, you don't get an idea of like where these patterns actually get used. It's like, well, where am I using horizontal tabs? And all of that. So what Pattern Lab does is actually, it tells you which patterns make up a particular pattern, and it tells you where this thing actually gets included, which is awesome. So this is back to that one pattern I was showing you a little earlier with the names. It says, the block media link pattern contains the following patterns: Adams square. So that's that little image there. And I know it's round, but that's CSS, you know that. The block media link pattern is included in the following patterns. It's included in the profile navigation, the section media list organism, the account settings template, and the accounts edit template, right? So you get this idea of like where this thing's actually included. This is huge. Like this is, whenever it comes time to like edit or maybe even remove a pattern, it's like, okay, well, if I were to edit the horizontal tabs pattern, and let's say like make the tabs bigger, blow out the padding, where do I need to test, right? What do I need to go through? What's this affecting if I were to make changes to this thing? So Lineage, this idea of sort of demonstrating context is absolutely awesome. Here's another project that I worked on. My wife and I redesigned the Pittsburgh food bank in our city. And again, sort of this is their global header pattern. It says the header pattern contains the logo, the search, and the primary navigation. And then it says the header is included in the following patterns, and it like lists every single template, right? Because it's a global element, so of course it's going to show up everywhere. But yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff: pattern status, pattern search, media query displays, keyboard shortcuts, like a bunch of other stuff. Dave's done great stuff with it. Pattern Lab 2 is coming out soon. Dave actually just came up to my house to talk about it, and it was pretty cool. It was like he's been doing a hell of a lot of work, and I've sort of been like on the outside looking in, and so he actually sort of got me up to speed on what Pattern Lab 2 is going to do. And to just sort of show you generally, basically the big thing that Pattern Lab 2 is doing is he's modularizing everything. He's sort of pulling it was sort of built monolithically. And what we found is that different people are like, I don't want to use Mustache. I want to use Twig. I don't want to use this thing. I want to use this. I don't want to have to bulldoze all the demo patterns you give me by default. I want to sort of have my own starter kit. And so that's what Dave did. Is so he sort of tore Pattern Lab apart and modularized everything, and sort of just really quickly going through what each of these things are. Each of these are like now their own like repository, which is pretty wild. So Pattern Lab Core, what that does is stitches everything together. So that's like the basic nuts and bolts of what Pattern Lab is. Pattern Engine, this is again, like some people like using Mustache, which is what I've been showing, and that's what Pattern Lab was built with. But now we have things like if you want to use Twig, so like a lot of Drupal 8, I think, is what Drupal 8 is going to use Twig. So we had like a bunch of Drupal people like, yeah, like let's make this work. So then we can sort of make Drupal sites a lot easier with Pattern Lab. So that's the idea behind that. But again, the idea is that you can use your own templating language. If you like handlebars, you like Blade, you like Jade, you like blah, you could sort of, use your own pattern engine. Style Guide Kit. Style Guide Kit is just this. And I've seen people that have like sort of branded that toolbar up at the top, but it's basically like the Pattern Lab interface. The starter kit. The starter kit is what this stuff is, and by default we have like a little really disgusting looking, like this is my beautiful intentionally ugly web design work. Again, the idea behind this is like we don't want people actually using this stuff, like the guts of it. We want them to replace it with their own designs. So what the starter kits allow you to do is just like swap in your own default patterns that you find yourself using again and again. And then there's this, and this is really, really exciting, this idea of plugins. So sort of you could build and extend Pattern Lab even further. So people have been hacking Pattern Lab for a while. So Tim Cadlick, who's going to be here doing one of the other workshops about performance budgets, what Tim did, and this is, I think, is so freaking cool. He set up a grunt task that basically set a performance budget, and if you get under a certain, or if you get over a certain page speed, then that over is bad. Or wait, no, am I wrong on that? Is page speed higher number is better or lower number is better? Do you know? Anybody? Lower is better? Okay. So yeah, so if your page speed score is too high, meaning that your web page is slow, he built it into Pattern Lab where it'll yell at you and turn bright red, right? So as you're developing, it's like, screw you, you're doing a bad job, which is awesome. And he might actually cover this in the workshop, but like that's freaking cool. It's, again, sort of taking this invisible idea of performance and making it very visible to make sure that performance is a priority for everybody. And so he hacked Pattern Lab to do this, but like with this idea of plugins, Tim could make that an actual plugin, and then everyone can sort of just, chuck that into their projects and whatever. And so all of this stuff collectively is what Dave's calling an addition. So like if you work at an agency, so Sparkbox might actually have like a Pattern Lab Sparkbox edition, and that includes all the plugins, all the patterns, all the modifications and stuff that they need, and collectively can sort of spin up a new site really, really quickly, which is pretty cool. There's also different sort of data structures that are supported, so you can now use YAML, you could use Markdown and stuff like that in addition to JSON. So that's pretty cool, and it's like a little more human readable and stuff like that. So yeah, Pattern Lab, if you want to check it out, if you haven't already, it's patternlab.io. Needs a little bit of a website refresh. And if you do check it out, things go wrong, blame Dave. I am washing my hands of the matter. No, but it's actually, Pattern Lab was like really stable now and stuff, but Pattern Lab 2 is right around the corner, and Dave's been just doing an excellent job. And he does like all of this in his free time. He's got a family, he's got kids, and a full-time job, and so it's just really, really freaking cool that he's making this happen, because we're all benefiting from it. So really 3 cheers for Dave, I think. So okay, cool. Any questions without getting too far in the weeds, but like any questions about like Pattern Lab, what it is, how it works, before we move on to like how to actually make it work? Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned PHP as being its core, so in an organization that IT actually actively blocks PHP, that you just can't run local versions of it, and it'll scan our computer and whipping boy.
Yeah.
Is there any? You mentioned, I thought, something else that someone is version 2 going to be a little bit more agnostic, or do you have to use?
No, it's PHP, but again, like the engine itself is sort of like its own thing, and so there's a Node port of it, and there's also a .NET port of it that's a little less. I think it hasn't had a lot of activity in a while, but like basically. So the idea is like if whatever environment it is that you work in, you can take a look and sort of port it over. And the way that the architecture is now, it's like all you need to do is like figure out how to stitch the stuff together. So like use whatever like includes and loops and whatever. Like it's mostly syntax changes more than anything, but you'd still be able to make use of like the templates and the sort of front end and all of that. So all of that's decoupled now. So it's not impossible to build your own port. And of course we would love it because the more languages that it supports, the stronger the project will be. Yep. Okay. So whenever I talk about responsive design, I threw this question out here a while ago. I was like, what's the hardest aspect to responsive design? Is it the the nuts and bolts? Is it responsive images? Is it grid layouts and stuff like that? Or is it the process? Is it updating your workflow and convincing your bosses and your clients and stuff like that? And just overwhelmingly, people are like, yeah, it's the people, hands down. So what I'm going to do is share a couple projects I had the good fortune of working on, and sort of just walk through how our process looked to actually bring these projects to life. So one is a mobile version of Entertainment Weekly. It's, I think, still it's only being sent to mobile devices, so it's like an M.dot site, but it's fully responsive. It's sort of like them dipping their toes into the water. It's a conversation for another day. Techcrunch, which is a technology blog owned by AOL, and then what I've already been sort of referencing is this Time Inc. Site. So first order business is selling this stuff through. And this is something I hear a lot, how much is a responsive web design cost? The answer is always $13.47. It's just like, I was not expecting that exact value. But yeah, so of course it's a really hard question to ask and stuff like that. And but you need to sort of help bring people to light on, here's why this matters so much. But increasingly, we have all of these really great sort of case studies of people actually, going through and seeing all these like giant bounces in their conversion rates and so on and so forth. Here's one based, right? Homage. You guys like Ohio natives, right? I love Homage. They do a great job. Is there shop in Dayton? It's in Columbus. Okay. And Cincinnati. All right. But yeah, they're great people. And they saw like big lifts out of their site whenever they went responsive and stuff. Really, really cool. MTV sort of seeing big gains. But like anyway, I'm just showing this because it's like for the couple of you that are still having problems convincing people that it's like, hey, look, this stuff matters and it's going to be really good for our business to do this stuff this way. Throwing a bunch of numbers at them and increasingly seeing a lot of case studies. Ethan and Karen's great responsive design podcast is a great wealth of treasure trove of like people across all sorts of different industries with success stories on sort of going responsive. So sort of once we get through the sort of sales process, it comes down to really resetting people's expectations or setting their expectations. Does this look familiar to anybody? This is a design review meeting for anybody? Sure as hell has been for me in the past. It's like, let's review the web design. And what do you got, right? Bill's going to go to the printer and print out a copy for everybody, right? Pass it around the table, get out your red pens. Right in the margins and stuff like that. It's like, of course, this just false, right? This is not how you interact with the web, right? And Dan, who spoke here, and who I had the good pleasure of working with on these projects, just really summed it up really nicely. He says, we sell websites like paintings, right? Instead, we should be selling beautiful and easy access to content agnostic of device, screen size, or context. And I just think like that's just so beautifully spoken. I couldn't agree any more with it. But yeah, and that's a big thing. It's sort of helping your organizations understand that like, hey, look, the world has shifted, the landscape has shifted. Like, therefore, we need to, shift with it, or else we're going to die, right? The other thing that really, really needs killed is this notion of this sort of outdated waterfall process. I like to point out that guy's wearing business casual, going over the waterfall. It was very dressed up for the occasion. But yeah, so like, this is historically how we've done things, right? It's like you kick off a project, you might do some research, and then sort of information architects or information designers and content strategists or whatever you want to call them sort of go away and they sort of figure out what this thing's going to be and what it's going to do, and they write it all up in Balsamic or what the hell's the other one? Well, InDesign and all those other tools, right? These sort of wireframing tools. And you generate this 200-plus page PDF, and you show it to the client, and they're like, yeah, that looks good, I guess, yeah, sure. And then they pass that off to a visual designer, and the visual designer goes through and brings that thing to life and applies color and typography and all of that stuff, paints inside the lines, makes things look amazing. And then you go through and show that to the client. And then you show that to the client, and then you show that to the client, and then you show that to the client, right? And then eventually, homepage _final _v2 _4 review _v65 _4 Brad _final final for production.psd, right? Will get approved, and then the visual designer quietly creeps over to the code cave, right? And slips the designs underneath the cracks of the door. And as they run away, they're like, get it done in 2 weeks. We're already behind budget. We're already behind. Right? And of course, the developers look at it and they're just like, what the? Yeah, it's just nope. Like, So I'd say that, one of the posts maybe I'm most proud of is this idea, or maybe not most proud of, but you definitely got a lot of response, is this notion that development is design, right? There's a lot of front-end developers in the room, and what tends to happen in organizations is like, oh, you guys write code, right? Oh, she's a front-end designer. Like, oh, wow, she's a front-end developer. Like, go over there and sit with the Ruby folks. Right? Whip us up some gems. I don't know what that means, but but it's like it's one of the write us some. Hey Brad, I need you to write me some middleware. I've literally gotten asked that, and I'm just like, wrong person. Like my mom is an art teacher. Like I've never had a computer science class in my life. And again, like I sort of mentioned that at the beginning, it's like there's sort of like a divide a little bit. Front end development is a big field, and actually we find that there's like more sort of interface oriented people who are more visual. Myself, I'm firmly in that camp, and then people that are like good programmers that just can also sling some pretty serious JavaScript, and that's great, and I think it's important to talk about those differences. But like, what happens at an organization is they're like, oh, cool, you do code. Well, this is what floor you sit on, right? And so that can't happen anymore. Front-end development needs to be a part of the design process right at the very beginning, right? So if this is time, right? If this is the x-axis is time, right? This is how it needs to be, right? We need to operate more in a cross-disciplinary way in order to do truly effective, realistic, and still gorgeous, still effective design, right? And I've found that it's not that like everybody's going to be guns blazing all the time. It's sort of the way that we've worked is a little more like this, wherever, at the beginning of a process, the information architects or, content strategists, like whoever those people are is sort of figuring out, doing user research, figuring out like all of that stuff. Yeah, of course they're going to be guns blazing at the beginning of the project because that's sort of where they're sort of operating. But that doesn't mean that I can't get started on work, or that doesn't mean that Dan or another visual designer can't get started on their work. So I'll sort of talk about, how we go through that process in a sort of a cross-disciplinary way to get projects out the door faster and to get into the final environment a lot quicker. So first steps is sort of gathering. And so in addition to gathering user research, interviews, looking at analytics, doing content strategy stuff, like all of that stuff is obviously really important. But you could also go into gather mode as far as like establishing a pattern library, establish a design system. So this is a tool called Stylify Me. And this is really freaking slick because all you do is you slap in your URL, hit the button, and it spits back all the hex values, all the colors you use on your site, all the font stacks, all the different sort of like layout things. There's other ones. CSS Stats is another one, and then Nicole Sullivan has one called Typomatic. I thought that I had slides for him in there, but yeah, Google those, put them in the meeting notes. But yeah, so that's one way to sort of gather and sort of kickstart, establishing a style guide. I would say that again, it's a good first step. It's not gonna solve all your problems, but it's pretty slick. The other thing, and this is something that I found to be just tremendously effective, really, really important step, is conducting an interface inventory. And what an interface inventory is, if you're familiar with this notion of like a content inventory, right? You go through every section of the site, every page of the site, and you say like, what it is, what template it is, who owns it, and all of that stuff. It's just like this mind-numbingly painful process, but at the same time, it's just ultra important to get a better idea of what it is you're actually designing, right? What content you have. And so that's what an interface inventory is like a content inventory, only instead of documenting all your different content, you're documenting all the different unique patterns you come across in your site. So this is my bank, who I hate. You could sort of see why, right? Just like I didn't even go through all the pages on their site, but like these are all the different button styles I encountered, right? These are all unique, which is just mind-boggling to me, I think. You can sort of like get in here even more, just like subtle variations and gradients and arrow placement and drop shadows and stuff, different arrows along the right-hand side. It's just incredible. But this exercise, what it's meant to do is sort of point out those unique patterns, those inconsistencies. You go through and do this for each category, right? Things like buttons, forms, hero areas, like interactive components, headings, and so on and so forth. And the idea is to sort of put all of this stuff under one roof, and you put this in a PowerPoint presentation, show it to your CEO, they're like, that's a problem, let's fix it. Right? It just becomes abundantly clear why establishing a design system is so incredibly important. If you contrast my banks with, this is Etsy, and I went through their entire site, and these are all of the buttons that I can find on Etsy's site. And you could just see, just like how much more deliberate, and like they run a really tight style guide driven shop, and you could just tell that they like have their stuff under control. And I think that it's really, really cool to contrast this. But even for an organization like Etsy, who's like in the process of going responsive and stuff like that, doing an interface inventory can help establish the scope of work. Right? So it's like you round up, these are all their little sort of carousel slider, content slider sort of things. And maybe, by doing this exercise, they could sort of have conversations. It's like, wow, we have 5 of these things. Well, maybe we can consolidate some of these, right? Maybe we can get rid of one of these patterns. But also just having those conversations of like, well, how long would these very interactive components, how long would these things take to convert into a responsive environment? Right? So it sort of helps you better establish the scope of work and sort of what that level of effort is going to be to put into a responsive environment. So, you're documenting your interface inventory. You're trying to promote consistency. You're sort of getting this stuff in here, and again, putting it in a very tangible way that allows you to sort of show this to anyone in an organization and then immediately understand, like, Houston, we have a problem, And And then it also, it helps lay the groundwork, like doing this exercise with everybody on your team. And this is the crucial part, is like getting designers, developers, product owners, bosses, whoever, in a room together. And this is something I do in like my workshops, like at organizations, is like get them doing this and sort of like divvy them up into teams. And then you come back together and present them to each other. And the hard thing is that you have to give things names, right? You have to like give patterns names. And what you find is that, a product owner might have a different name for a thing than a designer, than a developer. And so this exercise sort of helps start establishing that common vocabulary that becomes absolutely crucial to just organizational success, right? Everyone's on the same page. They start speaking the same language. Do you call this a carousel? Do you call this a slider? Do you call it, whatever? What does utility bar mean? What does blocks 3 up mean, right? So that's gather mode. So once we sort of go through and actually sort of gather all this stuff up, then we go into like the first phase of design, which I call sort of establishing direction. I love telling this story just because I think it's amazing. A friend of mine, she's a kindergarten teacher in Washington, D.C., and one of her students asked, "How do you make a website?" And my friend's like, "Well, as it turns out, I actually have a friend that makes websites for a living." And so they gave me a FaceTime call, and this 6-year-old girl, Ava, asked me, "How do you make a website?" And I said, "Well, it's typically a good idea to go through and sort of draw pictures, sketch out what you want that website to be and what you want it to look like." And then a couple hours later, I get this picture message my friend sent back to me. And I'm like, "Oh, that's adorable." And then I was like, "Holy shit." I was just like, this girl is like better than 90% of the designers I've ever worked with, right? Like proper labeling, like clear hierarchy, color coding for the X buttons, active states. Like this girl's 6. This girl's 6. And here's a home page, right? Again, proper hierarchy, active states, great layout. Her buttons are more consistent than my bank. It's freaking incredible, right? But I love showing this just because it's like I could build this thing right now, right? This is a sketch by a 6-year-old. Like I could build it. Right? And I think that we have this tendency to try to, I don't know, justify our salary or something where it's like we feel like we need to go through this grand parade to make this like high fidelity stuff in order to sort of get ideas out of our head and actually like articulate these things and get clients on board. And it's like, no, you know what? Like sometimes a napkin sketch is all you need. Sometimes a code pen little demo is all you need to get your point across, right? And it's about, Jason Santa Maria has a really great line. He says, ideas are meant to be ugly, right? It's about, at this sort of establishing direction stage, it's about sort of generating ideas and sort of getting things out there and sort of, setting up little hypotheses and sort of setting them up, knocking them down. So I got a chance to work with Jennifer Brook, on the Techcrunch project. Jennifer is an amazingly talented designer, and I'm just like so I consider myself really lucky to work with her. She used to be at the New York Times doing a lot of their like earliest mobile stuff, sort of running that stuff, which is like she was on stage with Steve Jobs whenever they announced the iPad. So it's like she's like. It's crazy, yeah. But these were, her sketching. She used Keynote as her sort of design tool of choice or whatever. But some of the first things we put in front of the client was like, okay, like here's just some like basic patterns we're going to be using throughout the interface. We have this thing, we're calling it a featured island, and this is where like some featured stuff is going to go, right? And notice that like it's 3 rectangles. It's not prescriptive. It's not high fidelity in the slightest. It's just like, here's what this thing is, right? Here's a river list. There's a reverse chronological list of news or whatever that we're going to be using throughout the interface. It's a blog after all. And then we have this thing, a river grid island, right? And so just sort of sketching these things out and saying like, look, these are going to be some basic things that we're going to be using throughout the site. And from a visual standpoint, again, like as Jennifer's doing that, Dan Mall, who's working on this project, was able, on these projects, was able to go through and sort of get started actually sort of putting together some design explorations. And for the Entertainment Weekly project, they were actually sort of running their own sort of desktop redesign, so they had already sort of gone through and done some of this stuff. And so this is actually pretty cool because they were able to sort of say, like, here's what we've sort of like landed on as far as like a suggested, like, you know, suggestive little, you know, visual direction. We want it to be sort of bold and colorful and sort of have like this nice, you know, sort of feel to it. Here's some basic ideas for maybe some textures that we're going to use. So this is great. And again, what this does is this actually helps facilitate conversations with the client. Another thing that we did was use a tool. Anybody familiar with Typecast? Typecast, a great tool. I think it recently became free. But what it allows you to do is sort of pair different fonts together, is come up with some different samples and stuff like that. And so this is what we did, because ultimately these things are publications, right? So reading, you know, the typographic experience of the site is pretty paramount to, you know, how successful the design would be. So Dan went into Typecast and started putting together things and sort of staggered them, you know, sort of Techcrunch has these big, long headlines, and so he's trying to like represent that stuff. And we put these in front of the client. And we, you know, this isn't like, here's what your site's going to be. It's more facilitating conversation. It's more like figuring out what they value and what they don't value. So Dan would say, you know, here's why we chose these things, and here's what like led to those decisions. And the kind of feedback we were loving hearing from them was like, oh, this just like feels a little too conservative, or this is a little too cartoony or too bold or whatever. Can we tone this back? Or, oh, this is sort of nice, it's nice and legible, and so on. And it's that process that we're actually getting at. We're figuring out what they value and what they don't value without doing a whole hell of a lot of work. And I think that that's like the big thing that you could get out of this, is like that design process. It's like, you know, of course every client in the world, those people around the boardroom, they just like want to see the pretty. They want to see the Don Draper reveal. They want to see something that's going to take their breath away. And that just doesn't happen. And increasingly, it's just not truthful. It's dishonest. It's unrealistic. And the sooner you can help get your clients and get your you know, your stakeholders, your bosses, your teammates on board with that, the better off you'll be, right? Because those conversations, while it might not feel like you're producing like work, you know, you're designers, but heaven forbid you actually ask questions and figure out what people like before you dive in and start showing solutions. You know, you need to do that. And from a code standpoint, this frustrates the shit out of me. Talk to a lot of places that are like, we're developers, we don't want to waste any time, so, you know, these designs need approved before we get to work, just because, you know, you don't want to have to go through and make something and then have to like remake it. It's like, God, like, it's just such like a lazy, awful mentality. And it definitely prevents like a lot of really good work from happening. I think of this stuff as like being a prep chef. Front-end designers early in the process need to be prep chefs. For those of you that have ever worked in a restaurant or know about the whole restaurant industry, it's like there are people, these prep chefs, they come in the night before, they're chopping onions, they're chopping broccoli, they're chopping chopping broccoli, I've never said that before. Chopping peppers, marinating meat, getting all this stuff ready so that by the time everybody's in the kitchen the next day, right, they could focus on making meals. They could focus on sort of getting things done and getting food out to the customers and all of that stuff, right? And so front-end developers, by sort of in that sort of more traditional waterfall process, they're just getting started, far after the design phase is already started. And that sort of increases that chasm in between design and development, right? So the more sort of prep work front-end developers can do up front, the more they'll be able to actually collaborate with those other disciplines, because it's not like, hang on, I need to go away for a couple days to sort of establish these building blocks. If those building blocks are already established, then we could actually roll up our sleeves and sit side by side and actually work on some solutions. So that's what I do, is sort of go through, I spin up Pattern Lab. I'm like, okay, we're going to have some inputs, right? We're going to have some forms. All right, for Techcrunch, it's like, okay, we know we're going to have a site search. We know we're going to have a newsletter sign up. We know we're going to have a basic contact form. We know we're going to be using this third party for comments and stuff like that. So I could do all of that from like day one of the project. I could be writing markup, right? This is a publication, so we're going to have things like block quotes and pull quotes and things like that. Things are unfortunately ad-driven. And these things stick out like a sore thumb in an otherwise, nice, fluid, responsive interface. So we could bury our heads in the sand, or I could take the ad requirements, put together some dummy ads or whatever, and get those into the interface as quickly as possible to make sure that we're accounting for those requirements and sort of designing around them earlier in the project. So again, I'm chopping peppers, right? I'm chopping onions. I'm getting things ready so that whenever, the visual design progresses and the interaction design progresses, I'm right there ready to go, like, okay, let's do this thing together. So that's that sort of first phase, is a sort of very basic foundational sort of design phase. And once we have a solid idea of what the design direction is and stuff, then we're able to roll up our sleeves and get to work. So this was Robert Gurrell did the IA for Entertainment Weekly. And again, sort of same basic things where it's like, okay, here's our different templates, and here's the basic content blocking around these things. And again, it's still very, very, very suggestive. And we did eventually sort of make things that are a little higher fidelity, but like we didn't do too much of that. And back to Jennifer's work with Techcrunch, here's like what her final wireframes look like. Right? Again, just really, really suggestive stuff. Like, here's the thing. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but here's basic like content hierarchy and prioritization, and here's generally what this content's going to be. And while Jennifer is doing that stuff, and again, this is like within the first week or two of the project, I'm like, cool. And I'm looking over her shoulder, figuratively, because we are all a remote team. And I'm like, cool, I'm going to start building this out in Pattern Lab. I'm going to establish that featured island template, or that organism, and sort of include that in the homepage template, right? And if you look at it, it looks like shit, right? But that's fine. I'm just like laying the plumbing, right? I'm just sort of getting the foundation there. And from a visual standpoint, Dan would do what he calls element collages. What element collages are something like a little more tangible than a style tile, but still not a full comp. And it's still pretty exploratory. But what he's doing is he's actually sort of applying those little sort of style chiclets, the swatches and the type and stuff, to an actual interface element. And it puts them together in this little collage to sort of be like, okay, here's some explorations around how this thing could look. What do you think? And again, it's more about the conversation than it is about like, sign off on this, yes or no, right? It's more about like, yeah, like I like that. That sort of feels right. Or, this feels a little heavy-handed, or so on and so forth. And so we would sort of do that sort of in general, but then eventually Dan would sort of focus on one specific element. So this was one element. This is the global header for Techcrunch. It was the first element collage he did for this. And I think what's so cool about this here is that he's able to sort of design out the header without the client being distracted by what stock photo he's using for the featured area, or what the footer looks like, or what anything. It's like we're sort of honing in on one specific aspect and just saying like, tell me what you think, right? What do you think of this? And we're able to sort of keep the conversation around this specific module. And so the client didn't like this big gray bar going across the top. It felt like it was pushing everything down, sort of, didn't like that. So we did a couple iterations, and all the while, and I'm on these calls and I'm listening in, and I'm sort of there in the browser trying to integrate that feedback into my working prototype, right? So I'd have something like this. You can see very grayscale, very suggestive still, you could, like the client could look at this and be like, okay, yeah, like we get that that's not our final header. Everything's gray, everything's still sort of placeholder, but you could start to see it coming together. And we would iterate over that, Dan in Photoshop and me in the browser, and we'd sort of go back and forth, and then eventually this is what we ended up with for the final experience. So then we get these sort of weird states where like the global header would be done, but the rest of the page still looks like shit. And it's like, that sort of is weird. Like, just looking at this picture is like, wow, that's sort of bizarre. But because we are in sort of constant communication, collaboration with the client, they were able to sort of see the thing evolve over time. So they didn't see this as like, I don't understand what's going on. There's the header that looks more or less done, but the rest of the page isn't, right? They're able to say like, oh yeah, like looks like the header's in place. That looks good. Let's sort of continue on, right? So it's like, it's this very iterative, very sort of brick by brick sort of thing. But there does come some sort of limitations with that. Eventually, you do need to paint the full picture. And so it's at this stage that we actually did create real actual comps, full comps. They wanted to see what like a featured article looked like, what the homepage looked like, what a basic article looked like. And so Dan went through and actually created this Photoshop comp. And so you could sort of see, he has these different elements and sort of nice big like single column sort of thing with these little sides, comments and related posts, and then a footer and stuff, right? And this is great. And we would show this to the client. And the big thing here is that it's like, yeah, it was really important to create those full comps. So, designing in the browser doesn't necessarily need to be like only in the browser. It's about like, okay, we're going to sort of tie all this stuff together. We're going to make sure it works and feels cohesive. And then we'd present this to the client, and I think that we actually did 2 versions of this. The first time we went back to them, they were like, nope, like it just misses the mark. Like it's not at all like what we were feeling. Here's what we had in mind. So Dan was like, okay, and he went back and did this is the second version. And whenever we presented it to them the second time, they're like, yeah. And then they start getting into it, and there's like, oh, can we add like a little subtle gray border around this thing? And oh, can we like move this over here? Or can we sort of shift this down? And that's the kind of feedback where we're like, okay, like at this stage in the game, we're just doing like minor feedback. So we're going to get this into the browser and iterate on it there, right? And they're like, okay, cool. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So it's not about don't use static tools. It's not about like don't use Photoshop ever. It has everything to do with using the right tool at the right time. And then it's sort of coming back to this idea of like, sort of we would go through, we continue that process, we'd create some comps, we do some stuff, and then it's sort of getting into like what those sort of pages and templates look like. This is like the homepage template for Entertainment Weekly, and then here's what the final thing looked like. And if you look at them side by side, again, you could see the sort of placeholder stuff just sort of hanging out there, and then you could see the live site on the right and sort of see those variations. And in Pattern Lab, what Entertainment Weekly looked like was pretty basic, actually. It was pretty nice. It was like I think like a 2.5 month project, so it was pretty quick actually. But they want to see what the homepage looked like, and then they were also like, can we see what the homepage looks like whenever we're only showcasing the 5 latest stories rather than 10 latest stories. We just want to see what that looks like. And again, that's no problem. Like in Pattern Lab, all you need to do is be like, have an array, and instead of doing 10 things, you just do 5 things, and it just sort of magically displays. Same basic template, you're just sort of adjusting a little JSON file, which is awesome. And then they want to see what an article looked like, what a review looked like, what a TV sort of landing page, like a different section, what that landing page looked like and what the movies look like, and a little sort of photo gallery. That was it. Techcrunch, on the other hand, they had they want to see what the homepage looked like normally. They wanted to see what a homepage looked like whenever there was like a really breaking news, really popular story. They want to see what the homepage looked like during a live event, right? They want to see what a topic looked like for a person like Marissa Mayer, or a product like Google Glass, or a subject like AI or whatever, or a company like Uber or something. Still basic template, but again, we're feeding it different dynamic content to get them comfortable and showing them and demonstrating that, this system accounts for all of your different content types. Same thing with the articles, right? Here's what an article looks like. Here's what a featured article looks like. Here's what an article with a YouTube video looks like. Here's what an article with a press release looks like. Here's what an article looks like with like a legal document embedded in it. It's like all these different variations of the same template. But yeah, so that was our process. This is Trent Walton. I just absolutely love this graphic. Trent Walton talking about how sort of their process works, especially with respect to like layout and stuff. But it's this designing, it's this building, it's this concurrent thing, and it's sort of going back and forth, ebbing and flowing, using the right tools at the right time in order to sort of arrive at realistic sort of solutions. And I just love that. And we would do stuff like this. Like I would, Dan would hand me something in a static tool. I would try to implement it, and I'd be like, at this breakpoint or at this stage, it just sort of gets weird, or I don't know if it's realistic. He would screenshot it, and he would sort of take it back into Photoshop and fiddle with it, and then say, what about this? And then he'd hand it back to me, and it was exactly this. And it's just, if you could get to that point wherever you have front-end development, design, UX design, whoever, all working together, sort of working on the same thing and iterating over it, say that's a very good place to be. I think of it a lot like sort of subtractive sculpture, where it's like you start off with like a big hunk of rock, and you start whacking away at it, right? And you take a pass at it, and then you take another pass, and you start extracting a shape, like a human or something. And then you do another pass or two, and that shape becomes a lot clearer. And then eventually you keep that process up until you're like, okay, now I'm in a good place where I can start detailing the face, and move on to the arms, and move on to the legs, and eventually, finish the sculpture. And I like that. It feels like a very organic, very sort of honest, just sort of progression, and very honest process. And I feel like this really sort of became very visible for us whenever my wife and I did this food bank project. Since it's the two of us, I just sort of did everything in the browser, just because I'm like, I don't need to make a PDF, just because my tools of the trade are mostly HTML and CSS. So this is what our wireframes look like. Version 1. Version 2. Version 3, version 4, actually start piping in real content. Version 5, start styling things. Version 6, version 7, and eventually this is sort of what they launch with, right? And so again, it's just this iterative process of sort of increasing fidelity over time. And I hear this a lot. It's like, agile, or we were talking about it last night. It's just such like a bizarre, very specific, like capital A agile is a very specific thing. Somebody put this in the notes, but this is a very, very well worth your time to read. Brett Harned, who used to worked at Happy Cog, wrote about like how, especially in client services, it's really hard to do like capital A agile. But at the same time, I think that everyone wants to be agile in the lowercase a sense of the word, right? We want to be more collaborative. We want to be more iterative. We want to ship things sooner, and we want to sort of be more honest in our process. But that doesn't necessarily equate to like doing actual agile with scrum masters and all of this crazy shit. So moral of the story is that the actual like communication, collaboration between disciplines, between the client, between the organization actually trump whatever process it is you want to call it. And I'll say that it also trumps whatever deliverables you want to produce. Sometimes you might need to produce 80 PSDs in order to get your point across. Sometimes that's just what it takes. And so long as you're aware of like using the right tools at the right time, then I think you should be all right. Are we doing good on time or
We got another 15 minutes.
Okay, excellent, good. All right, well then I'll wrap up this section. This is all new, this stuff too, so you guys are like in on it first, because it's like, and that's, the cherry on top. I've never failed in my life, and and it was like, I mean, it was a hard project. It was a hard process. There were a lot of conflicts with the client. It was hard for them to understand certain things, so we need to clarify and stuff. But like for the most part, I'd say that it was like a successful process. But especially in the land of sort of client services, it's just like, oh yeah, like. And here's this beautiful design system that's really well thought out and all of that stuff. So it's like, and they live happily ever after, or did they? So this is what has defined my career, as in trying to do style guides. Right there beside the PDFs and the PSDs in the trash can. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, is basically like how to actually make style guides happen, how to make them be effective and be part of your workflow. So the first thing is you obviously need to make it happen, and that process I just explained hopefully will sort of help you actually make this stuff work. But you do need to sell it. You do need to talk about the long-term benefits of it. And what I found is that a lot of organizations very much and I'm sure this is true for really all of us. It's like, we need to get this project out the door. This is our 2015 roadmap, right? And if you're lucky, that's as far as they're thinking in the grand scheme of things. Oftentimes it's like quarter by quarter. It's people doing this. It's people as like, what's the thing that's right in front of my face? How do I get this hand out of my face? I'm literally, sort of paralyzed unless, I could get this out of the way. So it's like, naturally, it's like, oh, well, we need a redesign of the site or whatever. But it's like, that short-term thinking, while I get it, it's important, it's immediate, it's whatever, you have to absolutely sell people on the long game. Because style guides are very much like a fine bottle of wine. Right, they increase their value over time, right? It's a hell of a lot of work to establish up front, but so it has everything to do with convincing them that yes, this is worth it, not just for this quarter or next quarter or this year, but we're talking like 2017, 2018 and beyond, right? And it takes a lot of effort to convince people that. It's even harder because it's not like a responsive redesign wherever it's like, oh, we went responsive and we saw time on our site go up like this. It's like, it's a lot less tangible from like a metric standpoint. And so that's one of the reasons we started this Style Guides podcast, is to talk to people who work at organizations who have successfully established and maintain these style guides and talk about like, hey, how's that going for you? So it's like the more sort of ammo we have, the better we could do at sort of convincing our own bosses. Make it cross-disciplinary. I love this picture. This is my uncle's a chiropractor, and he has like all these brochures. And I was there and just sort of flipping through. I'm like, this is fantastic. I'm just like, yeah. but like. Again, one of the traps people fall into with style guides is like, oh, this is just something for those front-end developers to geek out over, or this is just something for the designers to care about. And I think that it's so incredibly important for every discipline, every product owner, everyone that touches the web site, the web product, the enterprise, the whatever, to be aware that this thing exists, and this is actually a place where we should be all hanging out together. So, just getting that awareness and building that awareness is so important for other people in the organization. It's also important to understand, from a component by component sort of level, back to those annotations. It's like, let's take our good friend, the carousel, right? The carousel, and we all have them, right? My joke about carousels is that carousels exist to keep people from beating the shit out of each other in meetings. It's like, I'm really important, I need to be on the homepage. Well, I'm really important too, I need to be on the homepage too. Right? Well, I'm important, don't leave me out of this. Carousel, everybody wins, right? Janet, get over here, we're making a carousel, get in on this, right? But yeah, so these carousel, this pattern has tremendous organizational ramifications and considerations from a content standpoint, editorial standpoint, that from a content strategy standpoint, it's like, okay, what's the kind of content we're featuring in this? How often does it get updated? Who's managing it? Who's maintaining it? How does this work? From a back-end standpoint, how is our CMS sort of built to sort of deal with this particular component? From a front-end standpoint, how does this thing work? What's the browser support like? What are the bugs around it? From a UX standpoint, it's how does this stuff work? How intuitive is it? From a visual standpoint, it's like, how do we art direct images so that they fit properly inside? So it's like you have this one component that has so many considerations for literally everyone inside an organization. And so what I think is that these style guides become so important as a watering hole for all of that content to sort of come together and sort of live under one roof, so that front-end designer knows the content ramifications, knows the organizational constraints, knows the back-end considerations, because everybody's sort of looking at the same thing, right? Make it approachable. This is super important. And again, a lot of style guides out there, it's like the spray of modules, and it's like, yeah, that's nice. But again, it's sort of, especially more code-oriented style guides, it could get really intimidating for people that aren't developers really quickly, and that sort of helps establish this mentality of like, oh, this thing isn't for me, right? It's got a bunch of code, I'm scared, whatever. So that's why it's worth taking the time to design a beautiful, approachable style guide that really points out what the thing is, why it's useful, and sort of how you can use it. Yelps does a really good job, but then you also have people like Salesforce, which just made this gorgeous one. It's so good. Gina Bolton was our first guest on the podcast, and she just really laid out a lot of really fantastic thinking that they did for theirs. This one's Heroku, that is a recent one. And again, just really sort of sexy and inviting, and again, that, it matters, design matters. Make it agnostic. So this is something that I see a lot. I work with a lot of organizations trying to help them establish their own pattern libraries. And you sort of have a lot of people, and organizationally things might be structured in really weird ways where it's like, oh, these people are on automotive, and these people are on flights, and these people are on, it's sort of siloed in very weird ways. And so you get sort of the pattern library reflecting this. And this is one that I found from, it's actually a really beautiful style guide, but they sort of have these courses, sort of instructional courses, and they call it course blocks. And it's that could be the name of your component, but at the same time, it's so tightly tied to a context that if you want to reuse that pattern, maybe that is, and put different content in it, it might not actually make sense to continue to call it a course block. So I think it's really important to sort of be more agnostic. Back to that sort of Heroku example, they have a list group, right, sort of cluster. And what's the other one? Oh yeah, this one I think is from Code for America, and it's a feature block, right? And again, it's you could put anything inside there, right? So it's portable, right, is what I'm getting at. Make it contextual. Again, sort of this idea of lineage and showing how this thing gets useful, why it's there, and how it gets used is really, really important. Make it part of your workflow. And again, so coming back to this is my Photoshop skills last night, by the way, guys. Like, pretty proud of it, actually. I was like, I need like a really shitty trash can, like an office trash can. It's just full of like coffee. Yeah, I'm pretty proud of it. But again, like, working in client services, and it's like, hey, we need you to build us a website. We're like, cool, give us money and we'll do that. And that's what we do. And then we deliver it, and we're sort of like, oh, and by the way, we actually gave you a lot more than just a website. We're giving you this whole system, this whole pattern library. Have fun. See you later. And basically what ends up happening is they're like, cool, I just need the website. And then, again, that thing dies. And these graphics right here, and this has been like, through the course of doing this podcast, has been sort of like the biggest, I think, epiphany for me. I come back to thinking, whenever I started working in mobile web stuff, that mentality of like coming from making desktop sites for so many years and having to undo all that thinking and get myself to think mobile first, sort of, I guess like before is mobile first, but like that took a long time to flip that switch. I don't know about you guys, and I'm sure we're still going through it really, but to like flip that switch to be like, oh, okay, like this isn't just like something that I need to sort of pay attention to. This is the thing, and then I could sort of scale up from there. Like that was a big pivotal change in like how I go about building websites. And throughout the course of this podcast, even though I've been designing these, systematic, pattern-based stuff, it has been this. It's like, first and foremost, we're building a website. And this sort of style guide is like a happy byproduct of that website. And I think how things need to be, and I think that this is going to take a long time, especially whenever you're talking about an organization and convincing entire teams and organizations to get on board with this. This is, I think, what it needs to become. And very, very few people have done it, but I think first, like the realization that like, oh my God, like we're not actually making a website, we're making a system, and that website is like a realization of that system. It's like one sort of, mutation, or what's the word, permeation of it? I don't know. Like it's like a tangible output of that system. But like again, instead of the style guide or the design system sort of as like this sort of off to the side auxiliary thing, it's just going to die off. It's going to end up in that trash can. But like it has everything to do about sort of forcing that style guide becoming the source of truth for your design and development workflow. And that leads to, the maintainability of the website in the design system. Like having that strategy in place, if you're an agency, building that into your contracts, if you're an organization, making sure that you're figuring out like who owns this thing, who's in charge of it, who's gonna update it, how often, who gets to slap wrists, who gets to fire people, who gets to push code to the thing, all of that stuff. Like this is really, really important. And what we're leading to is what was called the Holy Grail, right? Which is having a maintainable style guide, meaning that like whenever you make a change to the style guide, the production environment just magically updates with those changes, right? And this is, again, what is called the Holy Grail. And really the only people that have done it, there's like a handful of people. The Lonely Planet, Ian Feather's work around that, he's been on our podcast. Highly recommend you guys check out all the great work that Lonely Planet's been doing. And their style guide, they basically wrote the style guide, they have an API for it, and their production environment basically eats that API for the style guide, and the production environment and the style guide are in sync. So everything, again, goes through that funnel. Everything goes through the style guide first. If they need to make changes, they need to be like, okay, how is this affecting the system, right? So that's huge. And the last couple things, make it visible. Please, 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 please share. Please, please, please share things, make things public, share your case studies, share your failures, share your source code, share GitHub repos, share dribble shots, share everything that you possibly can. And I say this selfishly just because, I learn from everybody. I learn from the Starbucks of the world that put their stuff out into the wild. But it's also, it's not just for the greater good. It's not totally altruistic. I think one of the best ways, especially the bigger your organization is, the best way that you can make sure that the style guide continues to be useful is if it's freaking out there and it's front and center and other people know that it exists, and it holds you accountable. It holds you responsible for this thing. It's like, is this thing actually accurate? And the more visible it is, especially if it's live to the world, the better of a resource it's going to be. Not just for people outside the organization, but for people inside the organization.
Can I add one thought to that, Brett?
Absolutely.
We have some clients who are big customers that are trying to build their own internal teams.
Yes.
And this idea of making what you're doing public is a fantastic way to attract really talented designers and developers too, right? If you see an organization that's doing this stuff, that's trying to push the boundaries of what people are doing, you're going to want to work there.
Yep.
So making that stuff public is it's selfish in another way, which
Yes.
is like, hey, we're doing great work.
Yep.
We want great people to do it.
Yep.
So.
And that's been sort of maybe the most common pattern for everyone we've interviewed on the podcast. For MailChimp, Salesforce, that's actually how Gina ended up there. Is she saw the style guide and she's like, oh my God, I need to work here. And she's like one of the best SaaS people in the world, and they're lucky to have her for sure. But it's like she's like, yeah, these people are thinking the right way, and absolutely. So yeah, so and that's why we're sort of rounding all these things up like out there in the wild, and sort of trying to share this stuff to make the argument for thinking this way and for doing things this way as sort of watertight as possible. And make it bigger. Again, pattern libraries are great. They're very helpful for the web team. And everyone that's in charge of the web team, but there's actually a lot of other different kinds of style guides out there. West Virginia University, branding guidelines, identity guidelines, these things that used to be in like a physical book or sometimes in a PDF or whatever. It's like, here's our logo, here's how you use it, here's our stationery, here's like our watermark, here's these different things. These sort of global brand things that sort of transcend media, right? TV, radio, all of that stuff, like all sort of factors into this stuff. Like having a hub for all of that stuff is tremendously important. And sort of like one layer below that, we have things like IBM's Living Language or Google's Material Design, where it's like, it's broader than just like a pattern library for like the web, because this is, Material Design is touching all of their products, right? It's Gmail, it's Google Calendar, it's Maps, it's everything. And transcends different media types and stuff like that. So it's sort of one step above branding, because they can bulldoze material design, and they probably will, let's say a couple of years from now, but that Google logo will probably still remain consistent, right? So it's this layer that's on top of it. There's also voice and tone, right? MailChimp's Kate Kiefer-Lee's wonderful resource for MailChimp's voice and tone about how we actually how our tone of voice should shift depending on the context that we're talking with our customers, right? Like one of the examples she gives is like a marketing message, like, hey, sign up, here's this MailChimp, and he's friendly and fun and cuddly, versus your credit card just got declined, right? Like, I'm not going to be nice and bubbly and friendly and chimpanzee-ish. Is that a word? I don't know. But like you have to adopt a more serious tone of voice, and especially whenever you get like the larger the organization is, the more inconsistencies start to show itself. And what I think is absolutely fascinating, I was just talking with a few people from MailChimp, and I was talking to them in 2013. There were 100 people. 2015, 300 people, and it's like talk about establishing this shit like early on. This stuff is probably paying dividends for them right now, right? Hey, you have like 3 times as many people that work for you. Cool. Well, we have these guides, we have pattern libraries, we have sort of standards in place that allow you to scale, which is awesome. Writing guidelines. The Economist. This is like maybe one of the most traditional forms of a style guide, right? Grammar, usage. Again, there's might be some tone of voice stuff in there, but for the most part, it's like sort of nuts and bolts stuff where like if you're working with an organization, you need to follow these grammar rules. Same thing goes with code, right? You have like the GitHub, Ruby style guides and CSS guides and JavaScript patterns and stuff like that. All of that stuff is incredibly important. And again, pattern libraries, front-end stuff, all sort of plays into this broader ecosystem. And I think that the more your organization can do to leverage all of these different things, the better off you're going to be. And I think, like, again, sort of, I see it as like the formation of like planets, right? You need this like gravity, and it might start with the web style guide. And like as that starts paying off over time, it's like, maybe you can sort of add some more gravity and get some more visibility. And lastly, just make it last. Again, style guide is a fine bottle of wine. The more you can live with it and grow with it and extend it and maintain it over time, the more helpful of a resource it's going to be. You learn things from user behavior, user testing, A/B testing, analytics, design changes, hiring, consulting. If you could roll all of that thinking, all of those learnings back into your design system, you're just doing nothing but building a broader foundation for the future. And the coolest thing is that even if you were to totally bulldoze, let's say like a new CEO comes in and we're like, you know what, we're just gonna start from scratch, we're gonna do a total big major overhaul, big redesign. You know what, like you're still gonna have buttons, you're still gonna have forms, you're still gonna have a lot of these sort of elemental things. So you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You just need to like sort of, maybe reskin it or restyle it or, maybe refactor some things or pull different patterns out and introduce new ones. But at the end of the day, like a style guide should be established once so that you don't have to keep doing these major redesigns every 3 to 5 years. So definitely worth checking out the Style Guides podcast. I'm sort of channeling a lot of our guests and trying to spray it onto you. This is a wonderful visual, sorry. Let's eat food.
Thanks for watching the Build Right Maker Series. Check out our other videos from industry leaders at buildright.io. Or even better, buy a ticket and attend in person.